How do I straighten warp boards, I hear you ask? Alright, well, I'm going to assume that if you're asking that question, you don't have one of those big fancy jointers you see all the other YouTubers with. So, I'm going to show you how someone like me, without fancy tools, gets the job done. Let's go. But before we get into actually straightening some pieces of lumber, let's have a quick chat about why they might have warped in the first place. Firstly, you could be a tight ass like me and like to collect free pallet wood. This wood was probably never straight to begin with, which is why it was used on a pallet in the first place. Secondly, you could have gone out to your local hardware store, bought some lumber, not realised it wasn't straight. Unlucky. We've all been there. Thirdly, you could have actually been smart, bought a perfectly straight piece of lumber from the shop, got it home, and it's warped afterwards. Now let's have a bit of a chat about why that is. The main reason is this stuff, water. It's a cheeky bugger. When the moisture content of wood changes, it expands and contracts, causing the wood to warp.
Often wood will warp when you bring it home due to the change in humidity, which is why I would recommend storing it for at least a day or two before using it. If the sneaky bit of wood is going to behave badly, it'll likely do it in the first 24 hours. When you're storing wood, there's a few things to avoid to reduce the chance of moisture getting into it. Firstly, store it inside. The rain can be a major problem. Now it's inside, there's also a couple of less obvious pitfalls. Concrete floors actually draw a lot of moisture through them and into your wood, so we want to try and avoid sitting the wood directly on the concrete if possible. Obviously, storing your wood flat will also help avoid problems. These wood storage racks are amazing, however do take up a fair bit of wall space, so vertical storage also works fine. Just try to elevate the ends off the ground, unlike what I've done.
So now you know how to avoid getting warped timber in the first place. But what do we do when all those tips and tricks don't actually work? The first thing we need to actually do is work out what size pieces of timber we actually need for our end project. Why is that? Well, let's use this really poorly drawn prop to show you.
There are three main types of problems we'll be fixing. First up is the bow. This is probably the most common warp board you'll find. This is when the board is warped along the grain and showcases why we really need to work out what size pieces are needed for the project. Now this is an extreme example, but if we were trying to mill this down as a whole board, we would be left with a very small piece and a lot of waste material. Breaking the board down into two smaller pieces will actually create less waste. Now, let's fix this. Firstly, we draw a straight line across the bottom, and then a parallel one across the top, and we remove anything above and below this to make a nice little flat board. Another common one is the twist. Now, this is a bit beyond my ability to draw, but it's basically when a board has, well, a twist, or it's warped diagonally across the grain. Anyway, to fix this, we remove the high points at each corner until we have a totally flat top, then do the same on the underside, creating a much thinner piece in the end. The cup is much easier to visualise. It's when the board has warped across the grain. Similar to the bow, we draw a straight line across the bottom, and then a parallel one above, and remove any material across the top, and both bottom points, to give us, again, you guessed it, a thinner board. If we know the sizes we need, it means we can break the larger warped boards down into smaller pieces so we'll not need to remove as much material. So let's cut this board down to size.
So, now we have our boards cut down to size, we can start to mill them using our thicknesser. You might think we can just send them straight through the thicknesser to get a flat edge, but sadly we can't, and let me explain why.
A thicknesser does just that, changes the thickness of a board. This machine draws the board through a set of rollers, compressing it down until it comes into contact with the gutter head, which removes material. This requires the board to have the bottom surface already flat. In this instance, if we sent this board through, it would end up being an even thickness on the other side, but still warped. We fix this by using a simple sled to give us a straight edge for the thickness at a reference off. We simply place each board on the sled, give it a bit of a rock to see how it moves, then lightly chock under the board so it's stable and doesn't flex. Once the board's solid, we hot glue it and the wedges into place and run it through the thicknesser taking shallow passes. Now you can clearly see with each pass through the thicknesser, it's taking the high points off the board, and this is going to give us a nice flat surface in the end. So now we have perfectly straight, perfectly parallel edges on our flat face. We've got to do the same thing for our short faces. All we really need is some known straight edge to run along our fence on our table saw. So to do that, we have a couple of ways, but the main, well, easiest way is to use a bit of scrap, like this one, that we know has a straight edge. We simply attach this with a couple of screws to our scrap piece of wood and run it through the table saw.
Now, obviously don't drill into your table saw. Make sure that you're not doing that. But we basically screw it down, bring the saw blade up to the right height,
Now, we've got a perfectly straight edge on this. The only problem is, obviously, we've got some dirty Ow. Ooh, hot. Two things. Use a bigger size bit in your impact driver, and these are hot. So, we've got a perfectly straight edge here. However, we do have dirty holes from the screws. But there's a couple of better ways. Let me show you. Another way, which I must admit I'm not sure why it's not more popular to use, is double-sided tape. Now this works fine, however I must admit it does feel a little sketchy if you're not using good double-sided tape. So, do this at your own risk, I guess. We have, however, solved the screw hole problem. While you're here, do me a massive favour and hit that like button. The third and final way is to use what I call the poor man's jointer jig, which I actually really like. This sled's actually really handy, as I can use it to make miter cuts as well, and it's literally just made out of scrap bits I had lying around the garage. using a couple of T-track screws and some basic clamps. If you'd like me to do a video to show you how to make one of these, please let me know. To use it, you simply attach the bit of wood to the sled, and the angle really doesn't matter. However, you want to try to aim to cut off as little material as possible while still getting a full straight edge along the entire length. Now that we have one straight edge, we can take it off the sled, flip it over, and run it back through the table saw at our desired width.
It's a cheeky bugger. When the moisture content of wood changes, it gets very cold. It's a cheeky bugger. When the moisture content of wood changes, it's freezing. Oh, fuck.